What's up, wizards? Welcome back to another collaboration between Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology and Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate. I'm Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate, and with me is Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. So we spoke about what we were trying to accomplish with this series on the Centiloquium. I'm awful with all pronunciations. I read stuff, I don't pronounce it. And we're finally going to be able to dive into the first aphorism. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it? I'll also post it on the screen for us.
Yeah, I like the Partridge one translation.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so, and it says, it starts out with, actually gives the Latin. It says, abste and I don't know how to pronounce it, abste and a scientia. Okay, from thyself and science. For it is impossible that the artist should foresee the particular idea of things. Neither can sense receive a particular, but a general notion of the sensible matter. Therefore, or rather wherefore, he ought in these things to use conjecture, for none but one inspired can predict particulars. So it was like, okay, well, that's kind of confusing and hard to understand, and what are they talking about? So, we were talking about before, first of all, you're getting into the whole idea of the Platonic ideas. And so the Platonic ideas are the sense of, or the concept, I hate to concept because they're real, is that everything in the material world is an imperfect material instantiation of this ideal form. And so one of the problems with that is it's this idea that they're somewhere else. The Platonic ideas are somewhere else. And it's like, really what I like about it, there's different formulations of it, things that are similar to that. For example, the whole archetypes. So archetypes are sort of Jung's, you could easily see that he was influenced by the Platonic ideas and coming with archetypes. Another one is in Islamic, in Sufism or Islamic philosophy, the idea of the 99 beautiful names of God, or of Allah. And so, and these are relationships. So for example, Irab is the Lord. So, but in order to be the Lord, there has to be a servant. So, and you don't see Lordness. All you see is the Lord and the servant. And so, and the Lord can't function without this. It's an interesting thing is that God as Lord needs a servant. So the servant is just as important as the Lord. So for example, fatherhood, we can play around with that a little bit. The first time there's a one-celled creature that instead of fissioning took some of its genetic material and put it into another one, that's the whole gender and sex, and started fatherhood. I mean, so you have, and you look around and you can see lots of fathers and sons, but you don't see any fatherhood. But as long as there's fathers and sons, that relationship always exists. So, and no matter what the actual physical, changes that take place, that relationship of fatherhood is always existent and always conditions how those, how the fathers and sons relate to each other. So spiritual is interesting. These spiritual ideas are spiritual because they can't physically see them. Okay, you can only see their the physical manifestations, but those are never perfect. Like for example, if you think of like a triangle, ideally it's got three sides and you can conceive of it, but anytime you try to draw it or print it out or do whatever you do, it's going to be imperfect. Because whenever the spiritual, whenever these perfect ideas take on form, there's always a loss of perfection in manifestation. But every triangle is going to be the same in having those three sides, and so that again, that relationship is always continuing. So that kind of gives us a sense of what the spiritual is. Because people say, "What's spiritual?" It's like, well, it ends up being like a Star Trek-y thing of like fields or energy or something like that. Really, it's more basic than that. Like I said, it's these relationships, and the relationships determine the manifestation. So that's one of the things that this first aphorism is getting into, is this talking about the particular ideas of things. So it's when you look at something, so you could say, well, okay, you're only getting a general idea of things. You're not really seeing the perfect Platonic patterning. And really, that's what I think about when I was an astrologer. What I'm doing is that, rather than the idea that, and I hear this a lot, people are like, well, Saturn is transiting my third house or second house or whatever. And I can get the sense of like, they're like, there's this Saturn's up in the sky and he really hates me and he's beaming this energy at me and he's really messing me up and everything. And I need kind of a shield or something. I need someone to do that. And I'm like, I'm not really sure that that's the causality. My view is more that the planets are signifying, and that the planets are following these cycles, and their cycles are very easy to see. You can go 10,000 years in the future or 10,000 years in the past, and you can see those cycles taking place. But what they're doing is reflecting these underlying spiritual relationships, underlying spiritual cycles. So they're reflecting this cycle, and we can see that, and that's the same cycle that we are following as, in our day-to-day life and our, your natal chart or whatever other astrology that you're doing. So one of the things I like to use as a metaphor is the idea of two clocks. And one, they're both set to 8 o'clock. One has no hands, and the other has a bell. And so when the hands on one go to 8, the bell on the other goes off. So there's no direct causality there. They're just cycling together, right? And so that's more my view of how the causality works. So again, if you can see that Platonic idea of the situation, if you could see through the chart and see that underlying spiritual cycle, then you can know exactly what's going to happen. But that's hard to do. It's really difficult to see through to that exact patterning. I mean, if you look at someone's natal chart, it's exhausting. I mean, when I do a natal reading, it's very tiring because I'm trying to see the pattern of the pattern or patterns of this person's life. And so that's tiring to do. So that aphorism points to what's actually happening when we're doing a reading. And again, we're not breaking everything down to little pieces. We're not doing analysis. Right? We're doing synthesis. And the synthesis is putting together the chart and the patternings and seeing the sort of gestalt of what the chart is telling us about the particular situation or the thing we're looking at, whether it's a horary question or election, making a talisman, natal chart, or mundane astrology. So that's one thing. The other thing that this is pointing to and that I really like about it is it says, your science. Well, it says scientia. Now, scientia in Latin, in the medieval and Renaissance context, is not the science as we know it now. It's not this sort of atheistic, materialistic, technological, philosophical sort of thing that we're doing now. Scientia means knowledge, so really it's your technique. So when I'm doing a chart, what's interesting about traditional astrology is that, so for example, modern astrology, there's a lot of really accurate modern astrologers. I mean, they can look at a chart and do really accurate prediction. The sense I get from what they're doing is that it's like a tarot reading or a crystal ball, that the chart is a way of immediately accessing their psychic abilities and their intuition and everything. And there's really not a whole lot of technique there, And so, whereas with traditional astrology, I mean, if you're in the QHP lineage, Olivia Berkeley horary lineage, and you go to say John Frawley or me or Lee Lehman, you're going to get about 80% of the similar in terms of the reading, because they have a similar training and similar technique. And that's what I like about traditional astrology, is that you can get a whole lot of information just by going through following the techniques. So let's say let's think of an example with a horary question. So I have the first ruler represents, let's say it's a relationship question. Will I marry X? I get a lot of those. So the first ruler represents the querent, and the seventh ruler, because it's the house of relationships, represents the person that you're asking about. So let's say that seventh ruler is afflicted. So the technique says just, okay, that means that the person that you're interested in is either unable, unwilling, or unsuitable for the relationship. But which of those three is it? And that's at that point, you can look at the rest of the chart, but that's the point at which your intuition has to come into it. And that's what it says here. It says none but one inspired can predict particulars. So what's interesting about that is when I started off as an astrologer, people would ask me, are you psychic? I'm like, no, it's, science, all the technique, it's scientific. What I realized was that there's a lot of intuition that comes into it, but it's intuition that is taking place within the framework of the chart. So I'm not going to come and say they're afflicted and, oh, that means they love you and everything's going to be great. I mean, that's just not going to be, that's not coming out of that reading. But of the possibilities that the chart gives you, you choose one and you use your intuition or inspiration, and then that's how you get the answer correct. And so that's what I think is very interesting about this first aphorism, is it really does lay out a lot of what's actually going on in doing an astrological reading. What are we looking at? What are we looking for patternings? How does that work? the Platonic ideas and individual circumstances and manifestations. And then how much of this is technique and how much of it is inspiration and psychic ability? Because you can train your intuition, you can train your psychic ability. The more you do this, you do it. And this thing that's beautiful about traditional astrology is it gives you this framework. So you're not just immediately like a psychic, like, oh, I'm picking up vibrations. I mean, I think that can work, but I can't do that. And what's interesting in my technique too, if you do one of my courses, like the horary class, I have a section where all I do is almost mechanically go through and list the factors. And that, as I go through and look at the relevant factors in the chart that the technique tells me, then I almost invariably get a sense of it. And I start to tune into the situation. And then I can, by the time I'm done with doing that, I'm like, you know what, this is what I think is going on. And I'm able to be inspired, and that psychic ability comes into play. So it's very interesting to see those two operating, that it's not just technique, it's not just inspiration, but it's a combination of both of them. So again, that first aphorism I think is really fascinating. It's one of my favorites because it really goes very deeply into a lot of issues with astrological delineation in a traditional setting.
Well, I agree with you there, but I really think that focusing in on what is inspiration is also kind of important. So we have piles and piles of practices to help one become more of a vehicle that's appropriate for inspiration. I mean, you have the Ebermelon, where you spend 16 months in seclusion before you perform the ritual, and all of these kinds of things. And it goes to that ideal. Who is one who can be an oracle? Who is one who can be inspired? Kind of plays into the lifestyle of the astrologer. And Matthias goes into that a little bit in his descriptions of the kind of oath that you have to take to even approach this knowledge. And Valens kind of touches on it a little bit as well. And I probably shouldn't be pulling all of these sources in, but I think that it's good to understand how this is a tradition that's still living and has been living, and to really work on yourself and your understanding to plug into the macrocosm so that your microcosm and your macrocosm are in harmony with one another, because that's really what will allow that kind of inspiration to happen. And it also talks about that the specific. So it's plugging into the situation that you're in and into the reading that you're doing, which is something that you brought up. But if you're going to be predicting weather, it really helps to understand the location where you're predicting the weather for, because without having the context of being plugged into that world, you're not going to be able to be super accurate with your predictions, even though the predictions themselves are pointing you in the right direction. You have to have the requisite knowledge of the elements and how they interact in that area to know what the influences will do to them.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a couple different factors that come in. First of all, what I would say is if you do lots of charts, that's good for your intuition as well. Mm-hmm. You know, it's sort of like, I think the first thing you do for your intuition is that you don't distrust yourself. I mean, you need to drop the idea that everything's random and purposeless and that there is a patterning to things. And if you're constantly thinking this isn't true, then that's or doubting yourself. It's another thing too. If you're like, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this. I mean, I've noticed this. It's interesting when I do, readings and I do them over and over and over and over again, I start to lose my writer's block. And I realize that writer's block is sort of doubt. And the doubt is, can I even do this? And that's health. That's something to lose is the self-doubt. Now you can go the other extreme. And the other problem is to be too confident in yourself. So getting that balance. Another thing that's extremely important is the objectivity. And that's probably, I think, one of the hardest things for people to do is that, a lot of people are drawn to this because they have their own questions or want to look at their own chart. And so, for example, for a horary, if you're going to ask a horary question, you need to be emotionally involved in that. It needs to be something that's really important to you, that you really care about to get a good horary. The flip then is, though, if you're going to judge that chart, you need to be almost totally clinical about it if you're going to get an accurate answer. And if you're like, oh, it's my best friend, and she's asking if she's going to marry this guy and she loves him, and I don't want her to be unhappy. I mean, I've had people say that I don't want to make people unhappy. If you don't want to make people unhappy, you better not be a horary astrologer, because you're going to inevitably get people asking about difficult situations, inevitably going to get have to say no to people. And so, you want to be sympathetic and you want to not hit people over the head with it. But at the same time, you need to be you cannot be wanting it to come out one way or wanting it to come out another way, or that's going to affect your judgment. So it's interesting because we talk about psychic ability like a psychic, picking up the vibrations, but there's also this level of judgment. And that's the thing is, if you are worked in an area for a long time, you're familiar with it, you understand how it goes, then your ability to judge things just based on this practical matter. I mean, I'll give you a good example. I mean, I frequently get questions where someone will, usually a woman will come to me and say, when will my, boyfriend or whatever leave his wife? And you don't even need a horary for that because the answer is going to be never. I mean, it's just, that's the patterning for those situations. He likes it that way. He likes, he doesn't want to leave his family. He likes a little bit on the side. He tells you he loves you. He may even mean it when he's with you, but he has no intention of following through. And you almost never even need to have a horary to figure that out. And having dealt with people for the past 30 years and done those questions before, that's the patterning of that situation. Now, not to say it's impossible, right? But that's the general patterning of it, and that's how it goes. Now, that's not how the querent, they're like really, hoping and everything like that. But that's understanding that that's how things usually go is useful. And for example, when I could do legal horaries, which I can't anymore, it was certainly helpful to understand, how those questions went. I can't do those questions anymore, but that's a good example of that sort of thing. So again, this aphorism touches on a lot of really important stuff, and exactly how you're doing the reading, is something it's worth thinking about. It's like, what is going on when I'm doing this reading, and but the building up the experience. So there's judgment, experience, and inspiration, I think, all sort of blend together. And it's hard to have a strict delineation between those. And I'll get a feeling about stuff. It's interesting. I'll do a reading. I'm like, I really kind of feel like this. And the more I do this, the more I sort of trust that feeling. Now, the problem is, though, the feelings from the intuition, because I know I won the lottery. Is that an intuition, or is that just a hopeful emotion? So, that takes some time. And part of it, like I said, is stop doubting yourself and then pay attention and then notice it. Am I right about this? Am I wrong about it? And that's all useful stuff that's, as an astrologer, it's good to do, and do lots of questions. And as much as you can as an astrologer, you want to practice with real questions. And that's, and not looking at Hitler's chart, but instead getting a situation where you don't know the outcome, doing your prediction, write it down so you've got some record of it. And then you can test yourself and know whether you actually got it right, and then get the results back, and see whether you got that right. And do that again and again, do about 500 times. And then, you can, that really does help develop your intuition. So the Abramelin stuff is good. I wouldn't be down on that, but it's also, there's a lot of other things you can do. Just practicing as an astrologer is very, very helpful.